Oh, the violence! Hello and welcome to another installment of Plagued by Visions. My name is Juan, and please do excuse if I look a bit under the weather today. I know this change of season has us everyone sick, doesn't it? But I do want to say, while I'm lucid enough to do so, that I have opened up a Patreon for the channel at the surprising request of various lovely viewers. This is a rewardless Patreon meant to be a donation hub for anybody who would like to further support me and the channel. There are 5 tiers, and you can donate as little as $1 a month and up to $5 a month, and you can cancel anytime, of course. And for everyone who is planning on signing up or who has already signed up, thank you so much. The help during these tough times is truly life-saving and cherished. But anyway, yes, violence, the creepy uncle of all literary tools. I say creepy uncle because I've noticed violence is oftentimes an element in fiction that people are made most uncomfortable by, and the one which disturbed readers are most often standoffish or eagerly dismissive of. And with good reason, honestly. I mean, we can't really ignore the fact that written violence is indeed very often just an exploitative, cheap tool that debilitates the concept of transgression for a lot of literary works. Hell, the biggest points of criticism that transgressive fiction must contend with are the claims that it's all just avoid spectacle of violence with no further merit. And I mean, shit, these are the biggest criticisms that I have hurled at works of extreme horror like Talia and the Slob, for instance, that it's all just senseless violence for the sake of being senseless violence. However, it would be inaccurate to say that all forms of written violence fall under this category. In fact, I do think we would all be hypocrites if we said violence is only secondary to our pursuit of disturbing and transgressive literature. Violence, after all, is what I think draws all of us here. Sure, our goal might be to look past the violence, to dismiss it and to question it and confront it, and yet violence is almost always the entry point into all of these discussions. Take, for instance, author and scholar Carol J. Clover's impressions on the horror film The Texas Chainsaw Massacre in her legendary work of horror film criticism, Men, Women, and Chainsaws. Here, she details not just her gender-based interpretation of the genre's biggest tropes, with Clover most famously being the coiner of the term final girl, but also she explores her own journey as a first-time viewer of many of the films she critiques here. And in particular, she seems to have been drawn to an early scene in 1974's The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, in which the main cast, a group of friends braving the sweltering hot Texas roads, has picked up a very sketchy hitchhiker who then proceeds to cut his hand open and kind of ruin everyone's vibe. Clover, though, notes that after this scene transpires, Franklin, the main character's brother, continues to dwell on the act of cutting as he witnessed it, which happens to be one of the very few explicitly violent moments throughout the entire film, as everything else, the meat hook hanging, the chainsaw dismemberment, Everything is just suggested and worked around with camera angles. But here in this scene, Clover notes that Franklin's fascination with the wound and its relation to the overall nature of violence strikes a very fascinating take. As Clover writes, violence evinces a fascination with flesh or meat itself as that which is hidden from view. When the hitchhiker in Texas Chainsaw 1 slits open his hand for the thrill, the onlookers recoil in horror, all but Franklin, who seems fascinated by the realization that all that lies between the visible, knowable outside of the body and its secret insides is one thin membrane, protected only by a collective taboo against its violation. It is no surprise that the rise of the slasher film is concomitant with the development of special effects that let us see with our own eyes the opened body. In this quote, Clover is firstly identifying, I think, us, the horror viewers, right? Those who fancy themselves viewers of the disturbing and macabre. Yes, we who peruse these violent and confrontational corners of fiction are essentially enacting the same kind of fascination with flesh and meat that she describes here from Franklin, and astutely concludes that despite all the wondrous knowledge and interpretation that we may draw from it, baseness is the initial point for most of these dialogues. But moreover, what I'm really drawn to is the way she beautifully describes what graphic violence can signify for us who spectated. It is a wondrous revelation of our fragility, of our mortality, and of what can lie beyond the initial moment of aggression and transgression. And of course, these moments can happen literally, as in an appalling bloodbath that can fully grip our attention, but also, and perhaps much more importantly, it can happen figuratively, as film, literature, or really any art medium also possesses the potential of violently opening up psychological wounds in the viewer. And this is what is often referred to in psychological terms as triggers, right? For Clover and for myself, violence is a tool that bursts open the dialogue regarding the nature of said wounds and contextualizes human pain and suffering into what it can mean personally and societally. And these open wounds in the figurative and critical sense can be just as, if not even more appalling and disturbing than the literal violence from which they stem. And it is that bursting open of literary wounds that I want to focus on for this top 10 video. These are going to be my personal favorite picks for works of fiction that have really brought on these violent revelations to my reading eyes. Now don't worry, all the books that I've chosen for this list are still overwhelmingly graphic and violent, you fucking perverts. And yes, they will be very disturbing to some, I'm sure, you know, all that good stuff. However, this will not be a simple countdown of books with the greatest amount of graphic depictions of violence in their pages. I'm afraid that if that were the case, my list would be one, incredibly homogeneous and monotone, and two, filled with titles like Cannibal Pussy Skullfuck Extreme Volume 3 or something like that. Now, admittedly, that does sound fucking awesome, but that's not the vibe we're going for here. Instead, I have chosen to contextualize some of the biggest violent hitters in the Western literary canon in terms of what they have afforded to the concept of violent as a literary development. I will be going through this list in order of publication date, dating back to before Common Era times and into the end of the 20th century, and nowhere beyond that because I still haven't caught up to a lot of the 21st century in terms of horrible written violence. But hey, I'm trying. And so, without further ado, because I've already yapped for way too fucking long, let's begin this literary bloodbath. Ow, my fingers hurt so fucking much. Now for this first pick, oh fuck, that fucking hurts. I'm so sorry. Shit, oh fuck, excuse me. I think my fingers are a little, how do you say, broken. Oh, these hands are a little damaged, but I got it, don't worry. There we go. Now for my first pick, I've chosen the Holy Bible, written by Jesus. Well, actually, to be more specific, my first pick is a book within the Bible, which comes before the Jesus arc. I'm talking about the book of Job, a heartwarming story as old as time about a dude being tag team tortured by God and Satan because they were bored. I'm sure most are familiar with this story, but in case you're not, Job, aka the unluckiest fucker in history, gets caught in a divine bet between God and Satan. Satan says that Job is only devoted to God because of all the fortunes, riches, good health, and the amazing family that he has. And God, who here reveals herself to be kind of a petty diva, is like, nuh-uh. And then, to prove a point to Satan, for whatever reason, God lets the worst misfortunes and the most visceral punishments befall on Job. He loses all his land, he loses all his money, his family fucking dies, and then he gets leprosy. Because, God really needs to prove a fucking point here. I guess the most compelling thing about this story for me is that we're dealing with a cosmic, divine kind of violence, and it portrays God as a mercurial and even downright sadistic being at times, which horrifies my little Catholic boy heart to no end. And the book of Job recontextualizes what would otherwise be senseless suffering as a direct act of violence from God. And the main reason I have chosen this as my first pick is because I think it really marks a spot in Western thinking where there was a societal embracing of violence as a loving act of God. And that I find to just be really fucked up and tasteless, but maybe that's just me. Indeed, after Job goes to his friends who are just like, yeah, well, shit happens, bro. He goes to talk directly to God, who answers Job's questions of why me with a resounding, 'cause I'm God, bitch. Deal with it. Submit to me.
Kiss my toes, boy.
Yeah, it's probably just me, but I think the book of Job is where God really lets slip his BDSM and humiliation kinks for the world to see. It's honestly kind of even giving Guinea Pig 2, Flowers of Flesh and Blood a little bit in terms of concept, but I think Guinea Pig had a better script, to be honest. And in the end, there's a sort of happy ending because Job does get everything back that he used to have, multiplied by tenfold even, but only after he declares his love for God even in his lowest state. So yeah, the Book of Job is on this list mainly because it's essentially a social tool to generate submission to violence and an acceptance of horrible things delivered to us by higher powers. That sentiment, in my view, goes on to color most of Western literary thinking, so the influence of the Book of Job's treatment of violence, to me, is unignorable. Now, for my second pick, is my nose bleeding? How embarrassing. Oh my God, I do apologize. Should I be worried? Nah, I don't fucking have health insurance anyway. So anyway, for my second pick, I'm going to talk about Titus Andronicus, a play written roughly around 1594 and credited to the one and only William Shakespeare. Yes, for the few who may not have been aware, Shakespeare had a little bit of a stint as a splatterpunk writer. Titus Andronicus is Shakespeare's most violent play, featuring a rape revenge story set in ancient Rome, because as we know, Shakespeare walked so Death Wish could run. To briefly summarize, Titus, the titular character, returns home from war with the captured Queen Tamora and her sons. When Titus allows Tamora's eldest son, Alarbus, to be sacrificed via dismemberment and the tearing of his limbs, Tamora, of course, vows revenge over this, because it kind of pisses her off. And from there, the violence ramps the fuck up. Now, warning, I'm going to be giving some spoilers for this 16th century play, so be prepared. But for this entry, I mostly just want you to listen to how fucking insane this vengeful sequence of events unfolds. So, in one of the most infamous sequences from this play, as an act of revenge, Tamora's sons rape Titus's daughter, Lavinia, and afterward they cut off her tongue and hands so that she cannot tell anyone about what happened to her. After this assault on Lavinia, Titus's sons are framed for the crime and executed, which drives Titus to complete madness. And then in turn, Titus kills his own daughter to put her out of her misery, and then exacts his own act of revenge by killing Tamora's sons, baking them into a fucking pie, and serving it to Tamora without knowledge that she's eating her own children. And then basically in the final act, everybody fucking kills each other. Accounts of the play's staging during its time even claim that by the end, the stage was literally covered in blood. Now, I truly find this simulation of reality on stage fascinating, and I've even made a video on the most disturbing plays I have read if you're interested in that. But essentially, I feel like plays like Titus Andronicus really serve to remind us of the literal spectacle that violence can be, and the breakdown of boundaries between spectator and actor during a play must really make for disturbing confrontations. And I believe that this lineage of transgressive theater, which includes plays like Blasted by Sarah Kane, which I think is my favorite play of all time, this mode of confrontational and boundary breaking theater and storytelling, I think were made possible, at least in part, by the boldness and debauchery and the obscenity of this play, so it always holds a special place in my heart. This story is just so mean-spirited, so bleak, and in the end you wonder what the fuck it all even meant, if anything. And isn't that life, friends? Oh, fuck. Oh, shit, sorry, I think I fucking lost consciousness there for a bit. Oh, shit, is my fucking eye bleeding now? This is so embarrassing. I'm so sorry. How rude of me to be so unpresentable. I truly apologize. So our third entry pushes us forward a couple centuries, all the way to 1797. And this is the last classical work of perversity that I'll be covering before I move to the 20th century. But of course, as far as violence in the Age of Enlightenment, how could we not talk about the one, the only, the French pervert himself? And trust me, that's a tough title to gain. There's a lot of fucking competition. The Marquis de Sade, and specifically his super long and thoroughly obscene novel, Juliet. Whereas Shakespeare led the path to extreme horror with Titus Andronicus, I would call de Sade the first true extreme horror writer in full form. Juliet is a companion to another novel penned by de Sade titled Justine. The characters of Justine and Juliet are actually sisters, but whereas Justine's story is one of a truly pure-hearted girl who is corrupted and tortured by the evils and depravity of the world, I have chosen Juliet as my pick because unlike Justine, Juliet is just a fucking monster who delights in retelling all her libertine escapades for hundreds and hundreds of pages. She starts her journey of depravity by being raised in a convent as a little girl, only to promptly look at the lifestyle of nuns and say, no thank you. And then she proceeds to go absolutely fucking gorilla shit for the rest of her life. Now I'm not gonna lie, in my opinion, the book gets quite boring and repetitive, and I'll make a confession, I don't think I even made it halfway. So why am I picking it as a favorite? Well, just from my impression and in my opinion, the act of turning such appalling transgression, and believe me, this book has it all. Orgies, incest, torture, zoophilia, cannibalism, you name it. But turning all that into a monotone affair really encapsulates the philosophy of libertinism that de Sade is exemplary of, showing that even the worst of humanity's crimes can be imagined as a lifestyle, a quotidian reality, hinting at what a precarious position our morality is truly in. I confess I thought of including another book, Hog, in this list, and spoilers, it's not gonna be here, but that is because I feel Juliet outdoes everything that Hog sets out to do, but from a different kind of more prideful, voyeuristic, and self-delighted position. It is simply a book about the most horrible things humanity is capable of, a diatribe against God and religious propriety, and it exists only to enact this confrontation, to expand the boundaries of what's allowed, censorship be damned. And I think texts of that sort are important, Maybe not necessarily to read them, but more to acknowledge their existence and the unique place in philosophy and moral thinking that they forcefully carved out for themselves. Now, Napoleon himself saw the manuscript for Juliet and promptly had de Sade thrown into prison, where he spent the last years of his life. I don't know. Anyone who's written something so profoundly obscene and monstrous that they were fucking jailed for it deserves a little nod here on this channel, I feel. And trust me, there's gonna be a couple more such freaks. Oh my goodness, where are my fucking manners? Oh, that's more blood. Right, as if I couldn't embarrass myself anymore, right? Let's just move on. And now, jumping forward a couple more centuries, we finally arrive at the 20th century, the most bountiful epoch of gross and violent books, in my humble opinion. So to start, let's go to 1967 and explore one of the most violent human deeds that has plagued our existence since the beginning. Good old war. Marked by 2 world wars and countless other civil and colonial conflicts, war is truly the specter that haunts violent and transgressive forms of philosophical thinking in the 1900s. And I think the magnum opus of this exploration of conflict and dehumanization is none other than Tomb for 500,000 Soldiers by French author Pierre Guillotat. Now, this is a reissue made by Saliders over on Instagram, and I will put a link in the description if you wish to purchase it, as the original version of this is very hard to find and very expensive. So yes, the French again, who would have thought? So I think violence of the calamitous kind that war represents is near impossible to truly convey on the written page. How can a writer truly transport a reader into the war state of destitution and dehumanization with only words? Indeed, the reason most war accounts are accompanied by photography, which carries its own set of moral conceits, of course, is because it truly seems that words cannot do this horror justice. Recounting and staging violence is easy, of course. One need only list out acts of atrocity to do this. I could just say he cut his finger and there, I have simulated violence, haven't I? Yet, capturing the actual moment of pain and transgression, what Clover called the spilling over of the body into the cold, indifferent world in the quote I gave at the beginning, that is a monumental challenge, I feel. And Guillotat comes incredibly close to achieving this in his novel. In his prose, Guillotat essentially lays bare the secrets of the flesh and its pain state, without any rationale but with plenty of gory detail. The narrative is fragmented and often surreal, depicting scenes of extreme brutality, sexual violence, and chaos amidst the Algerian War for Independence, which Guillotat himself fought in 1960. The writing emulates the act of being brutalized over and over, hinting at a world beyond human integrity, a war-torn realm where blood and tissue speak their own stories because these are the only elements that prevail throughout the violence. All concepts of humanity are essentially annihilated here. Soldiers and civilians alike are subjected and objectified to horrible acts of such as torture, rape, and mutilation, all such descriptions feeling incredibly dense, debilitating, and maddening. Through relentless and disjointed vignettes, Guillotat engages in a dangerous dance of mimetics, depicting unseen horrific atrocities, which thankfully most of us have never confronted before, that might not necessarily make coherent sense, but they just carry a truly rancid vibe and weight that colors the entire experience, and they are often just a sentence or two long, but they stick. These vignettes invade the reader's mind with an ugly persistence, evoking the pungency of abject rot that haunts war, but injects it right into our psyche. Guillotat succeeds in acquainting us with the moment when the very skin of humanity is punctured, releasing nothing but a seeping chaos, and with good reason attached, since he himself underwent self-imposed starvation and other forms of extreme meditation while writing this novel, writing himself to a near coma, for he believed only a tattered and stressed mind, only a brutalized mind could actually accurately depict brutality of something like war. I'll say, to summarize, that I felt like I'd just been told that my first child was stillborn after I finished this novel. So if that sounds like something you want to experience, give it a fucking shot, I guess. And for the fifth... Oh! Whew, sorry about that. Obviously need a little more calcium in these bones. Anyway, for the fifth book, I've got yet another French author. Dear French people, y'all need to stop drinking that water, for real. No, wait, actually keep drinking that water. It makes for some really good books, such as this, 1973's The Lesbian Body by Monique Wittig. Now let's do a little thought experiment before we dive into this one. Think of a love poem written by a man about a woman. Often in said poem, you will find a fixation on a part of the female body, maybe a longing for a rosy cheek, a soft hand, or maybe an allegory for the vagina, things like that. In this patriarchal language of love, the woman's subject is often reduced and objectified to something sensorially pleasurable to the man. Wittig's Lesbian Body seeks to tear the language of romance away from these patriarchal conceits and does so in the goriest, most violent, surreal, and demented way imaginable. And I love her for that. Wittig takes a deep dive into the physicality and sensuality of women's bodies and searches for love, beauty, and sensuousness in the crevices and horrors that men would never dare adore. In its exploration of the identity of lesbian love, Wittig writes in fervent adoration of a woman's follicles, sensuously imagines peeling off her lover's skin layer by layer and admiring the raw musculature, the yellowed bones hidden under blood and tissue, and she depicts effervescent explosions of organs and more than once imagines really sexy and loving mutilations. And seriously, like, can we bring back that type of romance? Like, please? Like, I need people to try, is what I'm saying. And in the end, the most wondrous part about this book is that the reader does note how, through her brutality, Wittig has truly achieved a language that is uniquely female, non-patriarchal, and even in its violent and graphic nature, she truly edifies her own original form of lesbian romance. I can't even call this novel beautiful because I think it transcends that hollow definition. Maybe sublime is closer, but as I said, Wittig here has etched something that doesn't really have much linguistic precedence. I highly recommend this for lovers of experimental, transgressive fiction. It is one of the most captivating narratives I've ever witnessed and one of my favorite reads from this year. Oh shit, sorry. I think I lost consciousness for a minute. Or maybe a couple hours, I'm not really sure. On to the next book. Now, I am going to talk about the only novel I've ever read that I would fully define as transgressive fiction written by a Black woman, and that is Ava's Man by Gail Jones, first published in 1976. So, another book that I thought of including on this list was 1940's Native Son by Richard Wright, for I found said novel to be one of the most important and impactful depictions of racial violence in America, and in turn, the violence that said oppression, dehumanization, and marginalization can breed. However, in these aspects, I find Jones's novel to be superior, honestly, for its themes are treated with this unnerving sense of suffocation as we explore the life of Ava, a Black woman whose acquaintance with sexual violence and dehumanization begins from infancy. Ava is cruelly and mercilessly abused by her lover, Davis, who keeps her locked in her room until her psyche malforms and breaks under the strain of this isolation and punishment. Extreme violence and captivity are all Ava knows of the masculine sex. The insights that we can draw from written transgression, such as themes of sexualization, fetishization, commerce of the body, exploitation, etc., have figured prominently in Black feminist thought for decades. But Jones is one of few Black female authors who have dared to fully harness the transgressive energies of brutality, provocation, and misandry to where they explode into appalling horror, injustice, and chaos unbridled on the page with a strong and confrontational attitude. And to me, this is an attitude that I'd even venture to offer that she shares with most horror writers. Toni Morrison, Jones's biggest supporter and publisher during Jones's initial years as a writer, noted that the novel showcases the struggles Black women face with finding a genuine voice to express the legitimacy of their abuse and horrific experiences. In particular, Morrison touched upon how audiences often express disillusion at the fact that most Black female narratives of this kind centralize suffering. But Morrison incisively informs us how, above all, suffering is important to address because it is human, it is universal, and constant in the Black female experience in one way or another. But the entirety of our society is fashioned around the denial of Black female thought and agency. So I feel by centralizing suffering and abuse in this novel, Jones really turns these crude elements into a sophisticated dialectical conversation with the Black female experience. And in turn, through her narrative, even if Ava is abused, beaten, dehumanized, and exploited, all her suffering is brought into genuine conversation and therefore edified as a statement on the human experience. This, in my opinion, is one of the greatest American novels ever penned. Oh shit, I think more blood's coming out of my fucking mouth, dog. I'm getting kind of woozy here, man. I don't know what's wrong with me today. This flu. Anyway, jumping onto the year 1980, I'm going to talk about the only horror novel on this list, which may surprise many of you, but as you can tell, horror often pales in comparison to the writings of true maniacs and mentally ill people. But the one title that I do feel holds a candle to all these other ultra-violent affairs is Off Season by none other than my personal favorite horror author, Mr. Jack Ketchum, the scariest guy in America, according to Stephen King. And you know you can always trust his blurbs, right? Jack Ketchum's tale of backwoods cannibals having themselves a yuppie buffet is on this list for one simple reason. In my opinion, it really birthed what we now know as splatterpunk. I mean, sure, the actual origin of this subgenre, which is characterized by explicit, overly graphic depictions of violence, gore, and other shocking elements, and which also sometimes is defined synonymously with extreme horror, the origin of it is quite contested, and we could sit here and wax poetic about it. But the horror attitude and societal shock that Ketchum brought with his debut novel, in my eyes at least, is quite unmatched. This edition that I hold here with my broken hand is the first edition, which is not the original version Ketchum had in mind. This version was censored and even had its ending changed, since its publisher, Ballantine Books, deemed it too graphic and bleak to appeal to mainstream horror readers. Now, Ketchum had no choice but to agree to the changes since he was a then unpublished author who wanted a big break, but even the toned-down nature of this first edition managed to shock and offend audiences and critics alike. Complaints from the public were so significant, in fact, that Ballantine Books actually made the choice to pull the book from shelves, essentially enacting censorship against a horror paperback. And that is a feat that you should know is not really common for a horror writer to achieve, let alone in as recent a year as 1980. But Ketchum thus demonstrates that he really tapped into something truly putrid with this book. As appalled and offended as audiences were by this unusual graphic level of horror, and as scared as publishers were to take a risk with such a confrontational work, the decades following its 1980 publication offered enough evidence. Jack Ketchum, with this publication, forever changed the horror literary scene. And Off-Season, with its goring, splaying, and unflinching scenes of cannibalism that are sure to make your fucking stomach turn, stands as a monument to what horror is truly here to do. Horror is here to confront, to push boundaries, and to piss people off. Many today try to imitate this magic, but there's a reason why Ketchum stands near alone as one of the best writers of the macabre. Now, for the... What the fuck? Dude, there's like legit blood leaking out of my fucking skull right now. Oh god. This flu is worse than I thought. I'm gonna have to get some NyQuil or something. I guess it's more than a flu, right? I really don't know what's going on with me. I don't know. But as a working class Mexican, thankfully, I am used to ignoring health maladies because I can't afford to treat them anyway. So now into the 8th pick for this video, we are going to bring up a book that I already reviewed actually in the first video I ever made back in 2020. But here once more, it's receiving its Plagued by Visions lauding for being such a monumental depiction of human suffering and the folly of empire. That is Blood Meridian by Cormac McCarthy, first published in 1985. This novel is quiet, very placid, and that's what makes the abrupt suffering within its pages even more meditative and festering. This novel is a tour of the American West during the 1850s, the prime years of American colonization of the West, through the eyes of the kid who travels from Texas all the way to here, where I live, the Sonoran Desert. Yes, this novel ends right here in my backyard of Imperial County near Yuma, Arizona, and that's why it holds a special place in my heart. Because it was the novel that taught me that the only reason there's a modern society in this desert is because it was brutally built atop the brown bodies that were mowed down like brush as the American Empire greedily expanded from sea to shining sea. Yay us. So the kid joins a band of scalpers who essentially bathe the serene dunes and hills of the Sonoran Desert in blood as they journey westward. The contrast between the arrival of civilization, as colonization is known in America, and the actual deeds performed by the colonizers bringing this so-called civilization is what's most revolting about the violence in this book. It's the fact that all of this violence, all this gross spectacle is ultimately justified in the narrative of American history. McCarthy expertly showcases how essentially the veneer of civilized society is paper thin and built with lies, deceit, rape, and murder. McCarthy's depiction of the American West as a brutal, animalistic, unforgiving landscape serves as a poignant statement on the inherent violence that comes with empire, but even sinks further in and wonders, is this just the reality of the human condition? What really is civilization and being civilized? And are we naturally compelled to be savage animals with civilization only a construct, barely holding us back like a weak muzzle when greed and gain are on the line? Has civilization ever truly tamed this monstrous side of people? Well, for white colonizers, it definitely didn't seem to be the case, right? I tell you, reading this novel is like pulling back the curtain that is our star-spangled banner to reveal a mountain of bones and decomposing bodies. Being half indigenous American myself, as well as a Mexican, there's a lot of Mexicans that get lynched in this book. So that's cool. I cannot express how important it is to recognize the violence of this novel as synonymous with the birth of this nation. Think on that, please. Shit, I'm so sorry. I think I fell asleep for a minute there, but my eyes were open, and that minute felt like a lifetime. It was really weird. But the good news is I'm all freshened up now. But now we go onward to the year 1989, and it is now time to talk about my favorite book that I read in the year 2022. Lust by Elfriede Jelinek. Now, Jelinek is primarily known as the author of The Piano Teacher, which film director Michael Haneke adapted into a critically lauded film, but not many know that Ms. Jelinek houses quite a repertoire of violence and bad vibes in the rest of her bibliography, and none has appalled me more than this little book. The entire novel consists of simply the first-hand account of a woman as she is constantly sexually abused by her husband, and then by another man that enters her life in an equally brutal way. And that's it. I wish I could say there is more to it, but it is just captivity, bondage, abuse, humiliation, torture, and then the end. So what makes this such a special book and a favorite of mine, and not something that can be categorized on the same shelf as the exploitation of something like The Slob, for instance? Well, to me, Lust truly exemplifies how the abuse and hatred of women is one of the rigid pillars upon which our society stands. Women's bodies are often used as the markers of where a society is at morally, for instance. When women show too much, act outside of their gender norm, or enact their own freedom, etc., it is often condemned as a sign of the end times, It is depicted as promiscuous and liberated women always eschewing in societal collapse, an affront to the concept of the nuclear family, all of that. And here, Jelinek truly shows what a morally and socially upright environment looks like in turn. The perpetual captivity and abuse of women. The abuse here is detailed not through explicit details, but in a mode that makes it feel natural. It makes it feel like just the status quo, the simple literary reality for women. Jelinek often describes sexual abuse through social metaphors or through historical details to delineate how abuse against women is perhaps not an abhorrent blip in moral attitudes, but an actual constant tradition and integral to the sexist world that we live in. Though beaten, raped, humiliated, tortured, our main character retains a steady literary voice throughout that is never once interrupted by the concept of abuse. Therefore, I feel Jelinek really reveals that violence against women seems a natural part of even our language and our art. Such is the message of this. It's truly misandrist and thoroughly condemning of men. And needless to say, this novel is fucking awesome. Oh, fuck. I keep spitting out blood. I'm so sorry, but is that my fucking tooth? Oh my fucking god, I actually spat out my fucking tooth. What the fuck's going on, man? Gee whiz, I'm so sorry, y'all. I'm just out of it, but I really don't know what's come over me. I'm being so messy. But thankfully we're almost done. We have arrived at the 10th pick for this video, and one that I recently covered in actually the latest video that I made, but one which simply cannot go without mention when we're talking about violence on the page. That is Tool from 1991, written by our dear angel on earth, Peter Sotos. Now, as I mentioned when talking about the Marquis de Sade, we were going to encounter another nasty-ass motherfucker who was also thrown in jail for being too freaky and a pedo. And well, lo and behold, Peter Sotos' Tool is a long-written monologue from the perspective of a man who is about to abuse a little girl. That's all it is. Page after page, just fantasizing about every form of torture, degradation, and abuse imaginable, all with zero motivation except the narrator's self-pleasure and his edification as someone powerful and destructive enough through the suffering of this child. Now, of course, the question is, why in the fuck would I name something like this as a favorite violent book of mine? Well, I think that in its exploration of violence, this work is monumental in the sense that it's the one true unbridled written perspective of a male abuser, which I had truly never seen depicted in such dark and pathetic clarity. Soto seems most concerned with showcasing what's allowed on the page, what sorts of thoughts are permissible to be spoken. Although I do accuse Soto's of being a diddler, or at least a diddler sympathizer, I can also, I guess, appreciate the long legacy he has for obfuscating those lines between his reality and what is simply his narration. For I feel like that transubstantiation between reality and fiction is something that violence can capture quite appallingly. For instance, Sotos does think these thoughts. I mean, they are in his head. He wrote them, so they had to come from his brain. But the sincerity of such thoughts really destabilizes the entire concept of fiction, doesn't it? For he really does achieve a narrative that is very much abuse itself, an abuse that the concept of fiction can't really seem to contain. To read this is to feel abused, to see how the desperate and pathetic abuser operates, with his loneliness and his lowliness always being marked. But it also feels invasive in a sense, very disconcerting to the nature of how obsessive he is. And there even lies a third layer to these shifts of perspective as they pertain to abuse, for the entirety of it is written in first person, which essentially forces us to recite these thoughts as if they are our own in our head, both violating our minds with its putrid interiority, but also forcing us to contend with the weight of abuse at such a disconcertingly intimate and personal way. So, in other words, this shit is nasty, but I mean, it never really aims to be anything else. It doesn't really aim to be anything, really. It just exists as a written record of taboo and perversity. And how could such a thing not be on this list? So that's the list. Uh, that's the list. Uh, Hope you enjoyed. Uh, I'm cold. I'm tired. I think I'm gonna go to sleep. Subscribe to my Patreon.